Hello, everybody. I'm Hank. Welcome to another episode of The Rise and Fall of the Federal Government. I'm back. I listened to my first episode and I realized that the eighth question I gave was, how did we get to this mess? And I thought, maybe I had better go over that before we really deal with the various departments next week. Now, if you're watching this after the last week of February, then the next week comment really doesn't matter. Okay, but back to the subject at hand. How did we get here? Everything in America is based on money. People can argue all they want. The reality is those who have the most money have the most power. Fair? No. That's just the way it is. The struggle to control the economy has always been a key part of the American story. So what I'm going to share with you in this video might upset some people, and that's okay. History isn't for us to feel all warm and fuzzy about it. History is what happened. You cannot put a 2025 moral judgment on things that happened in the past. You're not going to be able to go back in time and change diddly squat about those events. The only thing we can do is hopefully learn from it, and if it upsets you, figure out why it upsets you. Okay, now, by the way, I rely on what we call primary source documents. Those are the documents that were written by the people who were there. Not someone's opinion, not my opinion. And if you're actually interested in what the documents say and not what Fox News, MSNBC, or others say, then, remember, every news channel has an agenda. So check out books by Eric Foner, that's F-O-N-E-R. He's probably the preeminent historian, especially when it comes to source documents. Now, here we go, back in time. In fact, I'm going to take you back 160 years. Whoa, that's a long time, Bubba. But don't worry, I'm not going to go year by year, just going to summarize some things for you. It's now 160 years ago. We are in 1865. But why? Well, everything we are seeing today can be traced in one way or another to the America that came into existence after the Civil War. Actually, it even started before the Civil War, and maybe I'll talk about that in another video. But for today, and to conserve time, I just want to go back to just after the Civil War. Well, this is a subject that makes some people really cranky. Because if you went to school in most of America, you were given a rather slanted look at history, especially the Civil War and what took place afterwards. We all know, well, I hope we all know, that the Civil War ended in 1865. And from 1866 until 1867, there was something called Reconstruction. Reconstruction was something that was supposed to heal the wounds left by the Civil War. Instead, it became much like almost everything that Congress, comes up with, a totally failed program. My mama used to say the road to hell is paved with good intentions, and Reconstruction started out with good intentions. The biggest problem was that the rich people in the South, who had spent generations using slaves as cheap labor, weren't in the mood to let them go. In fact, they decided that even though the South had actually lost the war, that their way of life that they had before was the best way to go. They wanted cheap labor and to keep the poor people in their place. Before the Civil War, this was easy. The slaves were kept as property, and the poor whites were just ignored. That all changed after the Civil War, and the rich and powerful were scared that they might actually have to pay fair wages for labor. Well, what better way to maintain what they had than to make sure poor whites began to think of former slaves as people to be feared and people who were threatening their livelihoods? Kind of like what some in Washington and other places say about immigrants. In some respects, what's taking place in Washington is very much like what happened back then. The rich decided to make certain that they maintained their economic power. The political leaders in the South were blatant about what they wanted. They created what we know as black codes. Now, the black codes, since it was no longer legal for the plantation owners to actually keep slaves, well, they came around in 1866. It's a rather unique way to keep black people legally bound to the plantation. They created a series of laws that restricted the freedom of African Americans. Now, what were some of these laws, which were passed in 1866, but outlawed by the federal government that same year, and then reinstated in 1877 when Reconstruction fell apart? Well, some of them included vagrancy became a crime. Petty theft became a felony. Black people were unable to testify against whites. Black people were not allowed to serve on juries. They were not allowed to vote, and they were required to sign labor contracts that essentially turned them into property for their new employers. Basically imitated slavery and were used to reinforce the idea that black people were inferior to white people. Over the next 100 years, those were known as the Jim Crow laws and were only repealed by the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So then you have to ask yourself, who really ran the South? Well, after Reconstruction, the southern states were controlled by the Democratic Party. In fact, from the early 1880s, remember Reconstruction ended in 1877, until the late 1960s, southern states elected Democratic governors in every gubernatorial election, except in 1911 and 1921 when a Republican won in Tennessee. Yep, that's right. Democrats ruled the South. They were responsible for the Jim Crow laws. They were responsible for the segregation. Even though with the election of FDR in the 30s and John Kennedy in the 60s to the presidency, the National Democratic Party had become more liberal over the years. The South was ruled by the same racial animosity that had existed there for centuries. So, in order to deal with things, they came up with a new slogan. In 1968, in the South, a new catchphrase, law and order, began to take hold. Now, law and order, and the candidates who ran on that theme included governors such as George Wallace, who once declared segregation now, segregation forever, and Lester Maddox from Georgia, who used an axe handle as a symbol of opposition to civil rights. In 1972, then Republican presidential candidate Richard Nixon ran using that theme. Republicans have been using it ever since. As a result, over the next decades, old Southern Democrats slowly became Republicans. They adopted a social conservative tone and appealed to the puritanical impulses of many of the older churchgoers. They also began to appeal to the economic interest of big business and as a result achieved control over the South. Now, the influence of the Old South can still be seen by the number of Confederate flags that people still display and how many of the citizens believe that the Civil War was not about slavery. There is a distrust of non-whites and a fear that there is a plot to replace the white Christian in American society. Okay, now that's going to do it for this episode. I'm still going to try to live stream on 9 p.m. Tuesday, February 25th, and I'll discuss one of the real hot button agencies, the Department of Education. Until then, take a deep breath, try to relax, and peace. I'm Hank, and I'll see you all later. Bye-bye.